Welcome back to another episode of Building Up Your Business, the podcast. I am your host, Erica Dill with Operationally Up. Today's a great episode. We're talking about turning research into revenue, the art of the CMO Roadmap. So if you're looking at doing your marketing, you're thinking about how to make your marketing better and how to really build out that roadmap, today is going to be a great episode for you. We're joined by Angelo Ponzi. Thank you so much for joining us today, Angelo.
Oh, thank you for having me. I always love doing this, and I'm excited about the show.
It's going to be another great episode. Angelo is a seasoned marketer and brand strategist who specializes in turning marketing research into real revenue growth. With experience spanning startups to mature companies across B2B, B2C, and D2C industries, from SaaS and manufacturing to apparel, food, and beverage. Angelo brings senior level experience in strategy, branding, and go-to-market execution. Through his work at Kraft, he helps $5 to $100 million companies build clear CMO roadmaps that turn insight into action and strategy into measurable ROI, which I think is such a great topic to cover and really focus on today, because so many times people think of like marketing as just like, oh, it's something I have to pay for, or I dump it in, and they don't really look at that ROI, and they don't really look at the actual research and the facts that can go into driving that marketing. So I'm really excited to talk about today. So let's just kick it off from the get-go. Angelo, from a marketing perspective, how do you really define that growth roadmap?
Well, when people think about marketing, you started to allude to it. They go right to tactics, right? It's that tactical execution. And that, for me, is the last thing someone should be thinking about. What we really want to understand are kind of the dynamics of the market, the competition, your customers, your prospects, and really kind of, I call it, what do I call it? We're kind of breaking them down, peeling back the onion, if you will, and really getting into the nuances of what makes them tick. Why do they buy? Right, I have a client who was like, well, we've been in business for 75 years. Well, that's not a reason to buy. That's a reason to believe that, but it's not a reason to buy. So really understanding what's important and what's relevant to the people that are going to make those decisions to buy, whether there's a hierarchy in the B2B world or whether it's us as consumers. What's relevant to us? Why do we want to do this? And so research can help you identify those kind of elements and really get beyond what a corporation might think. I like to tell companies, get out of the boardroom, go talk to your customers. We can sit here and talk to each other all day long. But as a fractional chief marketing officer, I always say, I'm here because there is a problem. If you're just going to tell me what you already think and believe, then you shouldn't hire me, because I'm just going to turn around and execute probably the same bad strategies, right? And so it's hard for businesses sometimes to let go and back out and really kind of take a bigger view. But then ultimately, how do you drill down and get into those nuances? And to me, the only way to do that is to do research. Whether it's qualitative, whether it's quantitative, whether it's predictive modeling, whatever it happens to be. But getting at that data and knowing where to get the data, and then how to use that and to create those strategies and ultimately the plans or the playbook for growth.
Well, and there's so many times that I've talked to clients, to companies that are like, we had this great idea, we were going to do it this way, but the customer just didn't buy it. And it's like, yeah, because you thought it was a great idea, but that is so not what your customer wanted.
Well, and that's a huge mistake. There's so many case studies of companies that, I call it, the field of dreams syndrome, right? Build it and they will come. It might have worked in the movies, but it doesn't really work in real life. And companies, and I've been involved with companies earlier in my career that said, we're going to build something and people are going to love it and buy it, and they don't. I mean, I've worked with some consumer products, then I won't go into names, but if I did, you'd say, yes, I know that product. Yes, I know that product. I don't know that one. Why? Because we killed it because research showed nobody was going to buy it. And so there's, if you really look at behind the scenes, whether you're doing product testing, you're doing messaging, whether you're testing commercials or concepts, or just behaviors. I've worked in the alcoholic beverage experience, and I will say this one. I worked on Cabo Wabo tequila. And one of the things that somebody wanted to know, and I didn't really understand what was behind the motivations, but they wanted to know the impact of Sammy Hagar on the brand because he owned the brand. Well, later on, they found out that they were going to sell the brand. And so the people that were buying it wanted to know his impact. Was it good? Was it bad? Did people not care? And if you look it up, he sold that company for a lot of money. But the work that we did was about understanding his impact. So it's real simple. We worked on another wine business, and the branding kind of positioning was coastal. Well, when we got the business, we were like, coastal, we live in California. We'll just go down to the beach and take a lot of beach pictures and, do all this stuff. And right somewhere along the way, we went, we should test this concept of coastal. And we literally spent probably 2 months going around the country, going to lakes, going to the Gulf, going to the East Coast, going to the like Lake Michigan and Ontario, trying to understand what we thought people that lived there of the idea of what coastal meant to them. Yeah. And ultimately we discovered through the research that if we had done what our original thoughts were, it would have failed miserably because we would have come up with a campaign that was not relevant to them. Yeah. And so kind of digging in and kind of getting out of your head and really going to the people that are actually making the decisions and getting that feedback becomes really, really, really important in driving everything else.
And that makes perfect sense. And when you're thinking about kind of starting to build that roadmap, what is that very first question that you start to ask to go down that journey?
Well, ultimately, it boils down to what do we want to accomplish, right? I get this, hey, we're a $10 million company. We've been in business for 20 years, but we want to be a $50 million company in 3 years. Well, wait a minute. It took you 20 years to get to 10, and in 3 you want to be 50? Okay, let's really break that down. Let's break the business down. That's why I'm saying that kind of marketing, if you think about strategic marketing or kind of business analysis, so you need to break the business down into its finite pieces and understand your channels of distribution, your pricing, right, your profitability, all those different areas that you need to understand in order to kind of put it back. The words I was looking for before were deconstructing and reconstructing. That was the one I was looking for. So kind of deconstructing the business and then putting it back together and figuring out, okay, how do I become a $50 million business in 3 years that I'm going to do differently? Let's look at our products. Let's break our products down. Which ones are profitable? Which ones are driving the revenue and driving profitability? Which ones are just driving revenue but the profit's not there? Which ones do I keep around because it was my original product even though nobody's buying it or it's a losing proposition? So just breaking that down, understanding the dynamics of, if you're in manufacturing, the story I like to tell is we're in a meeting and the CEO asked the head of sales, "What's your goal this year?" And so I want $1 million sale. It'll be the biggest sale we ever had. And people are clapping and cheering, right? It was a real rah-rah meeting. And then came me, and I went, well, wait a minute, time out. And I turned to the head of manufacturing and I said, could you make that product?
Make it, yeah.
No, I can't. I don't have the inventory. And I turned to the inventory guy. Why don't we have the inventory? Well, we've already sold out of that. It would take 3 months to actually get it in place. And next thing you know, that $1 million sale caused an issue. Mm-hmm. And so not all business is good business, and right, understanding that. And then look, how does sales approach? Is it smile and dial, or do you have a team? Do you have reps? Do you have BDRs? I mean, all those different dynamics have to be kind of looked at in setting up that growth strategy. And then a lot of that, back to research, is what's important, what's relevant. Once I know what's relevant, then I can craft messages, then I can tell sales how to approach a particular client in a particular segment. Or if you're dealing with a hierarchy, you don't talk to a CFO the same way you're talking to the IT guy. If you are, then you're making a huge mistake, right? So you need to understand the motivations. So you can see right away, this isn't like, hey, let's come up with a new campaign next week, or let's figure out how we're going to sell another $40 million in 3 years. It takes time to really kind of strip it down and understand and gather that data in order to develop that roadmap and that plan of how we're going to execute. I'm working with a client right now, and they have some really, really lofty goals. And I literally, from a mathematical standpoint, broke it down and how many leads. I know their close rates. I know how long it takes for the sales. And it was like, oh my God, you have to have like 300 prospects in the pipeline, and frankly, in 30 days in order to reach your goal. It's impossible to do that. So you've got to get all these different things in motion, and you got to train, and you have to implement the programs, and right. And so it's being realistic and breaking again, laying that plan down, getting the team members from a collaborative standpoint, and everybody understands. So I'm a fractional chief marketing officer, but I feel more I'm a chief strategy officer, because that's kind of, I'm the orchestra leader, right? And we've got the band, and we put the band together, and we have to figure out how we're all going to play and make beautiful music together.
Well, and I mean, that's so true, because especially when you're working in small companies, like everything touches every department. So it's so important to have insights into all of the different departments and how they interwork and connect. And I love that example that you gave of like, hey, we want to do this amazing big sale, but yet do we have all the processes and inventory and everything in place to actually achieve that order? That's a breakdown in all of that communication. And one of the things that you kind of started to allude to that I think is an interesting point to touch on is being a fractional CMO, and you're obviously very data focused. How do you balance that creativity and data to get that perfect harmony?
Well, I've been told I can't draw a straight line with a ruler. So when it comes to the actual kind of the executional and the pretty pictures, I don't do that. But for me, it's about if you're my target, and now I've had this conversation, I know what's relevant, I know what's important, I know what the triggers are. I also know how you get information, how you consume information. Do you watch videos, or do you get white papers? So once you kind of in that process of gathering that information, I know in order to reach, I'm making this up, an IT guy or a CFO, I need to be, using a video. But if I'm for the CFO, but if I'm talking to IT, they want to see it. They want to see the white papers. They want to see the kind of the conclusions on why they should be doing it. So by knowing your journey, and you've heard this word before, right? Customer journey. How they consume it, how they find it out, and you're making sure that you're ever present in that journey. We know from a B2B standpoint, 85-90%, the data last time I looked says the first thing they do is they go to the internet. They go to your website, or they do a search. Well, if you search and your SEO doesn't put you on page 1, maybe page 2, you're pretty much out of the picture. Nobody's going to page 57 to find you, right? They barely go to 2. So you have to figure out how they're searching. So if you don't know that they're searching on the internet and all you're doing is, Facebook ads, you might miss the person that's looking for you. And, oh, by the way, is the business guy, the manufacturing guy we were just talking about, is he looking for you on Facebook? Probably not. So it gets back to competitive. Where are your competitors? What are they doing? What are they saying? Right? So this is kind of this intricate kind of web or puzzle picture pieces that you're putting together to try to understand all the different dynamics so you can make creative decisions on where you should be placed, your frequency, what kind of message are you delivering, what's important. Working with a client that does storage devices, if you will, removable, embedded, those kinds of things. But we have very specific vertical markets. Products might be the same, but what's of interest in aerospace is not necessarily what's the same in hospital, right, or medical.
Sure.
And so by knowing those markets, we can change the way we communicate to those. So again, back to that relevancy. I like to say there's no silver bullet in marketing, right? One size all one size fits all is not a good strategy. Why? Because again, it's, what's important to you and what's important to me are two different things. Yet if you're still trying to sell us both the same product, we're going to come at it a little bit differently. And that's, I guess, my points of really understanding those dynamics and how people consume and what's important and what's relevant is essential. I worked on a household cleaner before, and it was converting from a industrial product, if you will, to a consumer product. So we did all the research, and it was biodegradable, home compostable, and all this kind of stuff. So now we kind of had that aspect, and we did all this testing, and people were like, yeah, home compostable or the biodegradable, it's safe. If my kid drinks it, it's not going to get sick, and blah, blah, blah. And oh, by the way, it might cost a little bit more money. That was literally down at the bottom of the list. Well, once we launched, all of a sudden that price point came to the top of the list because it was like, yeah, well, you know what? I'll just tell my kid not to drink it, right? It was like people changed their opinion once the pricing. And so we had a strategic mistake. And so we had to kind of reprioritize and really look at, is pricing, are we taking too much profit? And again, selling through grocery, we had to deal with obviously distribution and profit margins and all those kinds of things. And then we rolled the product out across the country, including Florida and Texas, and we noticed that in the Hispanic markets, the product just wasn't moving. We were showing people how to use it and what to do, and then we went down and we investigated, and what we found is the way we were telling them, for example, to mop their floors was not how culturally they mop their floors, and therefore we weren't doing anything that was relevant to them. It was just a product that was yakking at them, but they didn't understand it and why they should use it, and so we had to go in. Now we had to do segmentation strategies and those kinds of things. So there, ultimately, it falls back to what are you trying to accomplish? What do you want to do? And understanding all those nuances and structuring that. And that, for me, leads to that playbook and that roadmap, if you will, to how to get to those ultimate goals. And then of course, you got to implement it and monitor it and adjust it as you kind of go along. A one size or a one and done, we'll do the annual plan, and you don't visit it again for another year is also a bad strategy, right? Because life changes very quickly. If you and I came up with a strategy today, tomorrow it's changed. And so if we're not paying attention to it, we're in trouble. That's why I'm a big believer in ongoing competitive intelligence programs. But a lot of times it's like, yeah, we did it last year. We'll do it today, but we'll look at it again, 6 or 7 months. 6 or 7 months, it all changes because if we're watching them, they're watching us. And so
absolutely.
Maybe they're changing much quicker than we are, right? So anyway.
You could have 3 new competitors in 6 months. Who knows?
Exactly. Or different competitors within each of the different market segments. And then what do you do? I'm dealing with that right now. I have 3 different market segments that we're dealing with, and there's literally different competitors in each of those markets.
Wow.
Which creates a different dynamic. It's not one competitor that's in multiple markets with me. It's different competitors in different markets.
You brought up that example that I thought was really interesting about the household cleaner and the pricing. And that, makes me think about when you're working with audiences, and especially if you're pulling them and asking questions and doing your research ahead of time, how do you really distinguish between what they say they want and what actually matters? And, that example was a perfect one. How do you kind of be proactive in kind of buffering against those challenges? Yeah.
Well, in hindsight, of course, if we had our way, that was all qualitative, right? So, for example, we literally, in the focus group rooms, we set up like mini stores. And so they could go and they could look at the shelves and talk about positioning. And yeah, I tend to my eyes go to the middle shelf versus, the upper or the lower. And the one at the bottom is already presumed that it's cheaper and maybe not as good, those kinds of things, right? So we're really trying to figure out kind of that visual dynamic. And then, of course, we played with pricing and tried to see at what point in time, looking at major competitors. 401 was like kind of the standard that people use for cleaning. So, our price point versus their price point. Normally we weren't in a spray bottle. Now we're in a spray bottle. How do we stand out on the shelves and all that kind of stuff? But I think, and I'm trying to think back, maybe we did 10 focus groups. We did a lot. But what we didn't do, and which we should have done in hindsight, was done a quantitative study and gone across the country and did, do the 5, 6, 7, 800 people. And at that point in time, we could have played doing, various techniques to look at pricing, to really zero in on what the true price point would have been and what was the margins that we had to deal with. And we didn't do that at the time. And I think in hindsight, if we had done that, we probably would have not had to gone through. And we probably also could have dealt with the cultural differences that we didn't get, by wandering around the country doing focus groups. So I think there's you have to make those strategic decisions on what a qualitative can get you. A lot of people go, yeah, well, I talked to some customers, but at the end of the day, that's still observational data. Mm-hmm. It's directional data. Where if we do the quantitative study, now I've got something that's very statistical and projectable.
Sure.
And they're two different ways to look at the information. I can probe in focus groups. I can't really probe in online stuff or quantitative studies. So again, back to what am I trying to accomplish? I had a client come to me last fall and said, I have a client, is actually another marketing person. I have a client who does enterprise supply chain software, but we want to come out with a not just a rework of what we have, but a new version targeting middle market. And our engineers have a list of 25 features that they'd like to figure out which ones are important, and we're targeting seven different vertical markets.
Wow.
And so we implemented a quantitative study to go in and look at each of the vertical markets, test the features using a process it's called MaxDiff. Anyway, it's like a different version of a conjoint analysis. And so we were able to test what features were important. And what we found is 5 of the features were the most important, and they actually fit across all of the vertical markets. But in every situation, there was a 6th that varied by every market. So our recommendation was don't go 5, go 6 or go 7. So we're capturing those ones that are outside the norm. But then we also knew what the hierarchies were, right? The first one was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. The next one was 4, 3, 2, 6, 1, right? So the weighting of those were not as consistent. The features were, but not the weighting of them. So by having that data, they could make conscious decisions, say, all right, I think, based on these 7 markets, here are the 3 that we think we can penetrate. Why? Because we know the competition varies in those markets for those. And so that gets into that kind of strategic decision making of where you're going to invest, right? You go into 7 different vertical markets. That's 7 different budgets. That's 7 different marketing campaigns, right? Because one size does not fit all. So those are kind of the things that we like to look at and trying to figure out. I finished with a client earlier this year looking at their dealer network. When we broke it down, we did a qualitative and a quantitative study. We were able to look at and put their dealers into a pyramid. So the upper ones, which they call the elite, then the preferred, and then down at the bottom were the authorized. And the authorized maybe sold 1 or 2 a year. But we were able to actually allocate dollar sales. So for example, the elite dealers, 1 out of every $3 that they had in revenue came from primarily our client, selling our client's products. The preferred, it was like 1 out of every $7. But the authorized, it was like 1 out of every 15. And so we already knew they weren't selling a lot. We also now know that they weren't getting a lot of revenue from selling our products or even similar products, because they weren't exclusive with us. So we were able to dig in more and find out what was important, and a lot of it was what they just didn't really understand it. They went for the low-hanging fruit, selling the old way that they did stuff, the old products, right? Why bring in the newfangled stuff? So again, that allowed us to create strategic approach, creative approach, and the kinds of things that would help change that perception and the tools that they needed and all those kinds of things. So again, I'm trying to give you just examples from different markets that, you know, there's commonality in what we did, but the end results were very different because there were,
Yeah.
you know, different verticals and different needs and that kind of stuff.
And you had talked a little bit about competitive research. We talked about competitors. How do you take that competitive research and apply it to your roadmap without just copying, oh, hey, this worked for somebody else?
Yeah, well, that's one of those kind of deconstruction, reconstruction things that we do, right? So by looking at the competitors, and depending on how deep the research is, a lot of times we're looking at messaging, because that's usually a lot of areas that we get into. We think our messaging is wrong, or the sales teams are telling us, you know, we're not resonating, they're not understanding what we're doing. And so we look a lot at messaging, and look, I call it looking for antis. What's everybody saying that becomes important, but what are the other ones saying it differently? So those features they're talking about, let's say, and then how do we say it? And then, you know, what's our ante? And then how do we differentiate ourselves? So we all have to say the same thing, right? We are X, Y, and Z. Well, how do I say it differently? And how do I make it that I'm more relevant? Well, we find in a lot of cases, a lot of companies are very company-centric in their speak versus customer-centric. It's back to that whole idea. If I know you, I can speak to you versus telling you about how great we are, right? I can tell you, you know, hey, I've been in business for 30 years, and we have all these people, we have great people, but there's a lot of kind of other nuances we look at. A process to help identify truth strengths would give us competitive differentiation strategies. But on the flip side, sometimes we get into looking at pricing and looking at product and really breaking down their offerings versus other offerings. I mean, there was a point in time I was doing some work for a real estate developer, and they wanted to know what their competitors were, frankly, were putting into their bathrooms, what competitors' products, and this was for like bath and toilets and those kinds of things. So one of those companies that made those products, they wanted to know who's going into these developers around Southern California, and I literally sent people out to go around, crawl under sinks and stuff in the model homes to take pictures and figure out, you know, what products were being installed, and then we could kind of reverse engineer that and say, okay, why are they being there? Who are their distributors? Are they going direct? And so we put together these, you know, mood boards and picture boards of, you know, underneath the sinks and stuff like that. It was actually pretty fun. I personally did not crawl underneath any sinks, but
Oh, bummer.
I sent a team. I grew up doing plumbing with my dad, so I didn't need to crawl under any any more.
You already
sinks.
knew what it looked like. So you're talking, you know, we've talked a couple times, and this is a great example of what you just talked about of doing that research. And you kind of alluded to making some boards. What are those steps that you take once you've done that research to really build that roadmap? Can you give examples of what those steps look like?
Well, it's think of each of the things we've talked about as building blocks. Right, so a competitive analysis going to give us some insights into what our competitors are saying and doing. Then the customer research is going to also give us insights of what's important. So now we've got, here's what the competitors are saying, here's what's important to our customers or prospects. Now let's kind of match those up. Do we have gaps? Are there opportunities? Are there things that are not being said but we know are important, but nobody's saying them, that gives us an opportunity to capitalize on? So we start overlaying these kind of, or again, I don't say putting puzzle pieces together, but it's really kind of an overlay and kind of building these foundations. Think of it as, you know, a building, right? We're building our blueprint. We have to understand how things are going to piece together and what's going to be strength and what's not going to be, and you know, and so we kind of look at it that way. And as we start to overlay all these different elements, that for us, a picture starts to appear that how I speak to you, what's important to you, I know what they're doing, so I know I need to differentiate. I know where it needs to go. I know if your website's not strong, no matter what we say and do and something else, it's not going to matter because they're not going to find you. And so we kind of, again, take all those foundational pieces, and it's the way we like to talk about it, and we start to kind of build that playbook up.
Got it. Yeah, and that's, I love the building block idea because you really are looking at it from a bunch of different angles, and that is what helps to make that picture come through. So I think that's a great way to talk about it. I know we're running short on time and there's so much that I still want to talk about, but a couple of things that I want to help wrap us up with is, a lot of times this comes back to the leadership team, the executive team, and you've got, the data and it brings out this picture. How do you really bring that leadership team along that journey without involving them in that nitty gritty, but really helping them to see that picture, especially if as we talked about earlier, they had this grandiose idea of, oh, I want to build this product. It's going to be great. I'm going to build the field of dreams. And then you have to say, hey, we kind of did this other thing and we looked at these data points and that's not where it's pointing. How do you really speak to that leadership team?
Sure. Well, one of the things, we have an assessment tool that we like to use, and it's strictly internal. And you kind of mentioned internal aspects, but we never really got into it, is I'm also a believer not only externally but internally. I believe that if the leadership team is not in alignment, a lot of the stuff we do might not ever be in alignment because they don't agree on stuff, right? So one of the first things we like to do is look at the internal leadership and understand from a variety of data points how they think and what they think. Because a lot of times somebody goes, oh yeah, that's a great program, but the guy running the program says, well, it's not that really that good. And then they start the debate, right? So we try to understand that. And the other thing is, my job is, frankly, honesty. I don't work for your company directly, right? You've hired me to give you not only my opinion, but my opinion based on things I've learned. And so if you don't ever really want to listen to that, then I'm probably not a good person to bring on board, because I'm just going to be honest. I tell people I'm going to say stuff you might not agree with and you might not like, and some of it's frankly not maybe favorable to you, but that's what I've heard. I literally did an assessment, and the internal people said that the new CEO was not, they didn't really like him and not doing his job or whatever it happened to be. It was a couple of years ago, and it was a family business, and he got mad at me. And his mom was there going, he's not saying that. This is our people are saying that. He just could not get past the fact that I was bold enough to tell him that. I worked for a med tech company a couple of years ago, and they wanted to sell. And after the work that we did, I had to tell them, I don't think anybody's going to buy your business.
Wow. And
it was hard, and I didn't get fired. I was really pleased about that. I figured I was out the door when I told them that. But to me, if I'd gone and just said, oh, everything's great and wonderful, and then I'm not doing them justice and nor
Right.
myself, right? So it's about integrity and just being honest. And I tell them up front, I'm going to tell you stuff you might not agree, but it's not necessarily just what I think. My opinions are being formed on research, on data.
Right.
And you need to look at that. There are so many stories out there of companies that didn't do that. One of my favorites was the 3D television. And they're all racing to the market, and I believe it was Vizio that got there first, and it never really took off and pretty much failed. And there's documentation that in the boardroom, somebody said, hey, shouldn't we talk to customers? And the answer was, don't worry about it. Right? And then one of the simple reasons it never took off was nobody wanted to wear 3D glasses to watch television.
The glasses, yeah.
Right? And so that simple disconnect, or if we had gone out and done coastal all over the place, or I worked in the action sports industry for about 13 years, and I had a research company. And we were hired by Fox to go and determine if this new show was going to work. It was called 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So we assembled all the kids and here in California, and we were doing our focus groups. But in the back, behind the glass, were a bunch of execs from New York wearing three-piece suits. And at the end, we sat and I gave them my reports, and their response was, these kids don't know what they want. This is what we're going to do. And I said, well, I just want you to know, here's my advice. This will fail, and here are the reasons why. They told us why it's going to fail. Right. And they didn't listen, and they launched the show, and I believe it was in and out in 6 months. It later got reworked based on some of the things we were saying, and it became Fuel Television, which lasted for years, right? Yeah. And so it's back to listening to the people that are making that impact. And that was actually just a funny story. I mean, it's, over the years, we've tested lots of different products and things like that. And I worked for this, it's really interesting. It was an evidence-based research company that did not talk to consumers, which the reason I took the job is because that blew my mind. How do we do that? And I remember we were testing commercials for a large financial institution, and they had 4 commercials, and we tested 3. And basically this idea of deconstructing and reconstructing, because that's where that came from. And we would deconstruct the scripts and the commercials, and we codify them and kind of piece them back together. And the idea, will this deliver on your strategy? They tested 3 and decided, because the first 3 tests, they decided not to test the 4th. And the 4th didn't work. And we're talking not a few $100, we're talking like $10 million in media buy. Wow. And it didn't work. And the cost to test it was $15,000. Oh. So that in a lot of small to medium-sized companies, when they hear the word research, they go, oh, I can't afford that. And my attitude is, can you afford not to do it? And it doesn't have to be really expensive. It just, you have to have a plan and know what you're really after. There's different techniques and things you can use. And, but even, again, just back to this whole premise of taking the time to understand the market and the companies that you're competing for is a way to build your strategies and your plans to, build that revenue growth plan. Again, it's whether you're a startup or a middle-sized market or a middle-sized in the middle market or even an enterprise. I mean, there's always things that are changing. And again, without gathering data or looking at data, I have companies, I said, you have Google Analytics? And they go, no, we don't have it. I mean, how do you know what's going on your website? I mean, I use that to help drive ideas for blogs and stuff for clients because the data's there. I just got to read it. So anyway.
Well, and I think you touched on what my last question was going to be. So maybe you can sprinkle in a little extra. But, when we're talking to these small businesses that are growing, those $10, $15 million companies, they're saying, oh, I can't afford research. Of course, I love your comeback of you can't afford not to. But what are some examples of those less expensive things that people can do that really can give them insight? I mean, Google Analytics is a perfect example of that. What other tips and tricks do you have for those small businesses?
Well, secondary research, which is stuff that's already been written or published. Secondary research won't specifically answer your question.
Sure.
But I call it might help you circle the wagons, right? And give some insights and motivators and behaviors that's technically free, right? Or maybe you have to buy a syndicated study to give you those insights. But a lot of times that's much cheaper than going some of the routes we talked about. But even surveying your own dealers or your own email list that you've been building, hopefully over time, right? Those are prospects and customers, and maybe there's a way to do that. And again, keeping in mind people's time, attention, time to it. I always don't know what I'm looking for. How attentive they are, right? You go in and you give them a 50 question questionnaire, they're probably not going to answer it, no. Right? So, And even the simple NPS or Net Promoter Score, you can kind of dig some data out. So there's lots of ways to gather information without it being this major undertaking. It's about consistency. Kind of one and dones are don't waste your time. But if you're watching competitors or if you're gathering data and every time you sign a new customer, get feedback. If you have customer service calls, a lot of the times we'll recommend to companies when you're taking customer service calls, record them. Why? Because we can analyze those calls and start looking at what were the patterns. One of my clients in the payments industry, when we lose a retailer, usually was preceded by a call. And so I was like, are we recording these calls? And they go, well, we type up our notes. Well, that's got to stop. Start recording the calls, and then we'll start analyzing, though, and we'll look for triggers. Are we hearing similar things that are giving us an indication that we're in trouble and we need to go make a change? And so just simple things like that. And a lot of companies record their sales calls.
Yeah.
But do you listen to them? Do you analyze them? Do you put them all together and figure out what's going on? It's simple. It didn't cost really any money. Just took time. And so there's lots of different ways to gather data and utilize data. It doesn't always have to be, hundreds of thousands of dollars. My brother actually is a researcher, and he works in reputation, and they do these things all over the world. They do country reputation analysis, and so their studies are like 10,000, thousands and thousands and thousands of people. But they're very high level, very specific. They can rank the countries and figure out, reputations of brands and things that he's done has been pretty incredible. But that's really high end enterprise folks, and they're spending, again, millions of dollars. I don't work with companies that spend millions of dollars on research. Hey, I wish they did. But there's ways to get data, and I always encourage companies that, even when we're done, don't stop because you stopped using me, because our project's ended. Implement stuff. I've got articles, actually, I think I even still have an ebook on my website about how to establish a competitive intelligence program. So it's just simple things that can go on if you just take the time. So a lot of companies, as you know, work in it and not on their business.
Yep, absolutely.
And that's a key. If you just step back, spend a little more time working on it and being more strategic, I think people can change.
I absolutely agree. And what a wonderful note to end our episode on today. Angelo, thank you so much for your time.
Oh, Erica, thank you so much. I had fun. Hopefully I didn't ramble on too much.
No, not at all. It was all very good, juicy nuggets of information. And thank you, everybody, for listening to another episode of Building Up Your Business, the podcast. I am Erica Dill, your host with Operationally Up. We're here to help your consumer goods and e-commerce business grow with maximum profitability. We'll be back in another 2 weeks with another great episode. So until then, remember, from bombs to order fulfillment, marketing to taxes, learn the stuff from the pros before you step in it. Have a wonderful day, and we will talk to you soon. Thanks.